Welcome to Intergalactic Tarboush, eclectic conversations from the MENA with Iyad al-Baghdadi and me, Ahmed Gatnash. We talk about politics, activism, tech, spirituality, mental health, and more. Hey Ed.
Hey man.
So what have you been thinking about today?
I mean, I don't want to say today, I'm going to say this week. Because there are certain topics that kind of like flow into each other and then you keep thinking about them. It's strange because sometimes you get an idea and it's not very clear. And then 2 days later you see a tweet which reminds you of like, okay, that's interesting. And then you start building it up and then it kind of mushrooms into something big. And then you're like, okay, I can sit down and write about it. And recently I've been seeing... Kawakibi Foundation, Kawakibi Center is bullish about on Bitcoin.
Yeah.
We have a Bitcoin strategy, and we're going to be talking a lot more about this maybe on the Arab Triumph Manual. But I'm starting to see this evolving, this arising narrative among people on the center and the center left in the United States, at least. Which is trying to tie Bitcoin enthusiasm to the far right. Almost like basically that, these Bitcoin bros basically are eroding Western institutions, almost as if Bitcoin itself and crypto in general are aimed at weakening Western institutions. And I'm just thinking, because, I'm sure that you can comment and correct that, but I feel that the narrative itself is coming from within, within people who are benefiting from more mainstream institutions, especially financial institutions. As for, because for those people, everything works, right? The institutions work. They just can't imagine why anybody would want Bitcoin to be empowered because, their own, whatever their financial world is actually in order.
Yeah, because the system works fine as it is, right? Why would you want to undermine the system when the system is wonderful?
So that's why the critiques to the system normally comes from outside the system, right? I can understand that a lot of Bitcoin enthusiasm, a lot of Bitcoin bros basically are in it for speculation. I understand that. But it doesn't mean that Bitcoin does not have some really interesting and exciting features for people who are marginalized, financially marginalized. In a way that what we're trying to do, and I think a lot of our projects in the future are going to make this clear, is that we're flipping the tables on this narrative by tying Bitcoin to a progressive vision, but also one that's coming from the outside, from the marginalized. But maybe you can speak a little bit about why we would be excited about Bitcoin.
Yeah, so over the course of 2021, I got really exhausted of seeing stories like, the latest was 2 or 3 weeks ago maybe, of one of the most long-established Egyptian human rights organizations shutting down. I don't know if you caught that, and that was basically because they were in too much danger and they couldn't even operate anymore. And everybody who's ever tried to operate any kind of human rights organization in an authoritarian country knows the game is very different when the person who you're playing against actually controls the banks. And they can freeze you out at any time, they can confiscate your wealth, or they can just sit there and watch money come in and out and surveil the people who donate to you and make it known that they're under surveillance so that they, receive the message and stop, and basically cut you off from society in that way. Or maybe they just decide to make life as difficult as possible. They cut off your organizational account and they cut off your personal account. So you can't live anymore. You can't support your family. They can make it so that you can't receive money from abroad. You can't get funding for your NGO to do whatever work it is, whether it's, actually dangerous work or whether you're just trying to create opportunities for young girls in a patriarchal society or feed hungry people or whatever. Like, it doesn't have to be necessarily insidious to the government for them to dislike it.
So these are basically organizations that funders, international donors, are happy to fund. But it's just too dangerous for them to receive the funding, and they can't, it can be suspended, or they can't use it, or it can be made impossible for them to use it.
Yeah, so when I'm seeing these critiques, I just think, again, it kind of connects to our last conversation about the US centricism and how sometimes they can't comprehend that their government is not the entire world's government and their set of rules aren't everybody's rules. Like, how far up your own backside does your head have to be that you can't even see that for some people having a currency which is basically privacy preserving and impossible to censor and decentralized is actually a complete revolution from a human rights perspective.
And keep in mind your example about NGOs, etc. We're talking about people who live in countries that already have a fully functioning financial system. You're talking about an Egyptian NGO, for example, in this case, but it could be anywhere else. We haven't even talked about places which don't have a functioning financial system. We haven't really talked about Yemen or Lebanon or Libya,
Yeah.
where...
I can add some color to that because, my family's situation in Libya is, I guess, the same as everybody's situation in Libya. But there are people who are on like $200 a month and their salaries are 6 months out of date, like 6 months overdue. And when they come, you basically have to go and queue in the bank sometimes 48 hours in advance because the bank has a limited amount of cash. And when it's done, because the country has a liquidity crisis. There have also at different periods been withdrawal limits, so you can have the money in your account, but good luck trying to get it. And on top of that, you're not allowed to actually spend it, like with a bank card. So you can't buy anything online, which, you're basically starting to wonder, what can you do with this money? Like, if it's...
Are there people in Libya who are leaning into Bitcoin?
There are a
as
few.
a solution.
Yeah, it's not very loudly spoken about yet, but it exists. I've been speaking to my cousins there who've been telling me, like, yeah, we know where to get it. This is how it works. It seems like there's not a very widespread understanding of it. And even the people who do know about it don't know about it very much. They don't understand it deeply. But it's good to see that it actually exists. And it's now even an option if I want to send... how I used to send money to Libya was I'd have to either give cash to a person who was traveling from here to there, or find someone who can accept cash from me here and give dinars in Libya, or even dollars or whatever, or I can Western Union the money to Turkey because there are people flying from Istanbul to Tripoli more regularly. Yeah. So, good luck trying to support your grandmother's surgery or your cousin get his graduation or whatever you want to do.
One person, of course, a friend of the show who's done a lot of work on this and he's written a lot of essays on this is Alex Gladstein. Shout out to him. He's written several essays about this. I think he's written about Afghanistan. He's written about Palestine. And recently, he actually just sent me the manuscript of a book he's writing called... The title of the book is Check Your Financial Privilege. And it's full of examples of this and not just analysis, but also real world case studies about this is how the title says it all. Is like the critique is coming from within a position of financial privilege. It's really interesting in the example of a country like Yemen, where not like a lot of people are on the edge of starvation, and it's almost it's very difficult to send money, and it's really interesting to see that some Yemen, it's not a lot, it hasn't become a movement, but it's really interesting how people will learn any technology that they need to use, even if it's complex. Necessity is the mother of invention. So
you really think this is beyond these people sometimes, and then they blow you away.
Yeah.
But yeah, I love Alex's work, and I recommend it to pretty much everyone I talk to about it. Especially my favorites are Uncovering the Hidden Costs of the Petrodollar and The End of Super Imperialism. And these are basically the essays that radicalized me, because you kind of get into it thinking this is like a really interesting technological invention, and then when you go down the rabbit hole, you come out thinking this is actually the end of US empire.
Yeah, no, it's amazing how he actually went. I think so. The more I read his stuff, I see that he himself went down a rabbit hole, and that's how he ended up writing such deep essays. But it's really interesting. We mentioned Yemen, and I'm switching topics a little bit here. Actually, I'm switching topics a lot. But I've been reading a book recently. In fact, it's the book is right next to me here, and maybe shout out to the authors. It's called Sectarianization, and it's a book which is edited by Nader, Hashemi, and Danny Postel. So the thesis of the book is really about how a lot of people speak about sectarianism almost as if it is endemic to the Middle East and North Africa. The thesis of the book is that we should be speaking about sectarianization rather than sectarianism, because sectarianism is not endemic, it is not essential, but there are processes by which authoritarian actors basically sectarianize societies because it's to their benefit.
So this is basically pushing back against the American ancient hatreds thing, which like the idea that sectarianism is just a part of these societies and always has been.
Very much. And what's interesting is that it's very academic. So it's actually a slow read. I mean, it's not something that you can read, in one sitting. It requires.
Not a page turner.
Yeah. It's academic language, so it's like condensed language, which I respect. And it's organized into chapters. Every chapter has its own, it's written by a different author. And it's like, I think 12 chapters, and I just finished the chapter on Yemen. And it just happened that this happened around the same time that the Houthis, were throwing missiles at the United Arab Emirates, which is a whole new thing. Maybe we'll come back to that thing. But it was interesting to read the origins of all of this, because a lot of the time we get caught up in the current events and we miss the context of like, how did this happen? How did we get here? And I was, because during the early Arab Spring, post 2011, of course, you were 18 years old at the time. I was 33, and that's when we started following each other online, etc. But if you remember, I had not covered Yemen deeply. I went from Egypt to Libya to Syria, and then I went, from there I went on to bigger projects, Arab Triumph Manual, Arab Spring Manifesto, etc. So I really like Yemen was not an uprising that I completely understood. So it was refreshing to understand that. But to summarize their argument in the book or in that chapter, they say that the problematic part really started with the GCC brokered transitional framework. So what happened is that in 2011, Yemen had an uprising. And the dictator, his name was Ali Abdullah Saleh, he was ousted, forced basically, out of power. And several GCC countries, including Saudi Arabia, including the United Arab Emirates, who are currently involved in the civil war over there, they decided to negotiate a transitional framework. That transitional framework had some serious flaws. One of them is that it gave immunity to Saleh, and that allowed him to continue to exist as a spoiler and try to come back to power in other means. And he basically allied with with the Houthis, which were his previous enemies. But it's also essentially what it did. The framework itself also excluded the Houthis. The Houthis right now, so maybe these terms are kind of obscure to some people. Houthis are basically the rebels who are fighting against the coalition movement in the Saudi UAE coalition in Yemen. But what's interesting is that most
theocratic movement.
So it is a theocratic. It's basically a populist, religious populist movement. What's interesting here is that most people think that there's only two parties to the war in Yemen, but actually there's multiple ones. I think there's 4 parties. So you have to speak about the Islah, which is kind of Muslim Brotherhood, and these are against the Houthis, but also against the UAE and the Saudis. I think there's some intersection with the Saudis, and then you have the southern separatists, which is again a different group, multiple groups. It's basically it's not really that clear cut. But what's interesting is that during the uprising, the Houthis and the Islah, who are currently fighting each other, used to be collaborating. But what happened is that this transitional framework, what it did is that it created a situation where the Houthis are excluded. So the Houthis became spoilers because they're not invested in this in this order. So they don't gain anything from supporting it, and they gain everything by overthrowing it. So that's how this is the thing that opened the door to Iranian intervention, to planning for a coup, etc. What they argue for in the book is that the author uses the word misrecognition, which is like basically they misread the actual fault lines in Yemeni society. They treated Yemen as if it is polarized along sectarian lines when actually it wasn't. So when you impose that framework, it basically sectarianized the country. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah. But eventually, they also this was not the roadmap was not like the transitional roadmap was not a roadmap to democracy anyway. And it was really sad. I mean, it was really sad how the chapter ended. The chapter ended on the note that the war has torn the social fabric in ways that might be irrecoverable. And a Yemen which is, contemplating a post-war Yemen is a painful exercise. A Yemen polarized along sectarian lines is now a social fact. It's just really, I mean, when you go, because the beginning of the chapter is talking about the uprising, and then from there you go to this really, really stark image. But in the end, I don't know. I mean, maybe this is what Mohammed bin Salman wanted. I mean, maybe this is what they wanted. No democracy in Yemen, destroying the possibilities of, the possibility of democracy in Yemen, but also creating a failed state.
You can't really discount the idea that it could have been deliberate, but in the world generally, you can never really discount the likelihood that it was complete ignorance and incompetence either. And that's also been a theme in the region's uprisings. Like Egypt, a lot of their breakdown was based on the choice of a really bad electoral system, which polarized the country. Libya, so much of what ultimately happened there was, originated in a really bad attempt at doing a de-Baathification process. It's bad policy imposed from the top and from the outside again and again. And it's never something that they weren't warned about. People criticized the Yemen deal at the time, saying impunity will be completely disastrous. If you let this guy keep running around, he'll never stop. And
yeah, I forgot the part. I forgot to mention the part where he eventually was killed by the Houthis. I think it was the Houthis who killed him. I'm not completely sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, I feel like we dove into an extremely serious topic, and so I feel like I want to end on a more lightheaded note. And you've told me that a lot of the stuff that you've been reading recently has been about psychedelics, and comparing that, comparing that how it fits within the traditional mental health paradigm. So,
yeah.
Do you have something about that?
I'm not sure if it's lighthearted. The topic itself is pretty, dark sometimes, but it's interesting that a lot of the criticism of the traditional mental health paradigm is basically that they're kind of teaching you through different techniques to manage your emotional state in order to better coexist with the world as it is around you. So they're basically telling you you're broken and fix yourself so you can fit better with the world, when sometimes you're fine. It's the world that's broken. And it's not really a healthy thing for you to be learning to accept it and live with it. You're meant to be angry with it.
Yeah, I can relate to that because I did CBT. My recovery from PTSD involved both. I started with CBT and then I did psychedelic therapy as well, and that was it was great because they work together. CBT is about behavior, and psychedelic therapy is about self-awareness most of all. And I did feel that there is a disconnect because I come from a certain background. I have my history, so I come in with a lot of anger. And then CBT would be telling me you need to control the anger or you have to see it in a big picture. While at the same time, the self-awareness is telling me, actually, your anger is completely justified. And it would be crazy if you're not angry. Like, anger is actually the healthy response when something like this happens to you. And that was kind of an eye-opener because I think that was when I started to say, okay, maybe I need to be more proactive about my therapy and my recovery, and I need to understand that these are tools. It's not like my therapist is not my boss, but he's someone who's trained to help me.
Yeah. So I found this cartoon It's like a drawing of a bunch of trees that have been chopped down, and there's a koala clinging to the stump of one of them, and the guy's pointing at it and saying, "This one has a mental illness. Its behavior is not right." Because it's clinging to the stump of a tree when it's actually doing like exactly what it's in its nature to do. It's just that, they've destroyed its habitat.
So do you know that the koala is actually a very stupid animal?
I didn't. Is it like a sloth?
It is. As far as I know, it's one of those animals that actually is pretty low IQ. It only lives on one tree. It actually eats the eucalyptus because the eucalyptus is poisonous to everyone else. So it's like it evolved to survive on the one thing that nobody else would eat. So it doesn't have competition, but also it means that it has, its digestive system has to work with that. So they're cute, but they're not very smart.
So that actually sounds similar to a sloth in that they have a really inefficient digestive system.
Oh man, the sloth story is a different story. The sloth used to be a huge animal. It used to be a giant animal. It was like, when human
like
beings appeared in the Americas, I don't know, it was 12,000 years ago. This is speculative, around 12,000 years ago. Sloths basically ruled the continent, right? And then we hunted them down, like we as human, human beings, we hunted them down, and eventually they had nowhere to go, so they eventually climbed up the trees and went for, started eating nothing but plants, to the point that we nerfed them so bad that now they became sloths. Like this killer animal became a sloth, thanks to human hunting. To the point that I actually read this somewhere, that sometimes eagles, when there's a sloth in their territory, they don't even kill it. They leave it alive because they use it to train their young. Anyway, there's a story about sloths and avocados that I'll say for another session.
Sounds good. Catch you next time then.
Catch you next time.
Assalamu alaikum.
Salam.
Thanks for listening. To support us, please leave a rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also find the link to our Patreon in the episode description. See you next time.